we're evolving, since we are evolving, but unfortunately backward and not forward. So one less heard narrative actually after the Cold War, which resonate perfectly with what we are experiencing today, but wasn't strong enough at that time to challenge Fukuyama, was Huntington's prophetic clash of civilizations thesis. Now, while Fukuyama viewed liberal democracy as the endpoint of humanity's political evolution, Huntington argued that global politics would now be shaped by cultural and civilizational conflicts, particularly between the West and the rest. Yeah, well, this is making more and more sense. Now, Huntington's views focused mainly on a new geopolitical landscape, I would call, where ethnic and civilizational identities would dominate international relations. Now, according to him, the new conflict would be between what he called as the ultimate human tribes, including civilizations, nations, and ethnic groups. And this marked a shift from traditional state centered politics to civilizational politics, reflecting very broader cultural divides that he believed were simmering, let's say, beneath the surface of global relations and the ecstasy of the New World Order. So, as I mentioned, his analogy of civilizations as tribes and ethnic groups appears more relevant than ever in today's world, as we witness a global rise of nationalism, nativism, and cultural chauvinism. So, today, not the Iron Curtain, but the curtain of culture, which is now the defining point of politics. And nothing more cultural and civilizational today than populism. Now, this does not deny the fact that populism remains a very ambiguous and contested term. This is why it is often associated with right wing politics, cultural nationalism, nostalgic nationalism, or even the shrinking of the cultural capital of a particular social group. However, this ambiguity and uncertainty that surrounds the term does not deny the fact that the huge popularity of populist leaders has been primarily attributed to their claims to protect the people against threats to their cultural, economic, and physical security. Now, when I hear this definition, the first question that comes to my mind is whether populism is an antithetical ideology to liberalism, or is it simply a seductive rhetorical and communication strategy that is increasingly attracting the electorates, let's say, around the globe? Now, the answer may be obvious to many, but what is more important than a simple yes or no is the why and how, which may not be obvious and therefore needs some reflection or some critical reflection, let's say. So, taking into consideration the core values of liberalism, now, which are pluralism, political moderation, human and minority rights, and the rule of law, uh, populist politics is definitely seen as illiberal or even anti liberal. Now, with a special focus on right wing populism, then this antagonism becomes even starker. However, the another question that poses itself in this context is what shall we do with the fact that populist leaders are now democratically elected by the people? So, this is a democratic paradox. But does this allow us to rethink liberal democracy and populism? So, can we think of populism as a weaponization of liberalism, or as expressive liberalism, or hard mode liberalism, where people are encouraged to say whatever they like and to uncover their true self? So, this debate can go for hours actually, but what I want to focus on today is the cultural and civilizational dimensions of populism and divisive politics and how this affects interculturalism. So, obviously, in cultural populism, the focus is on the cultural grievances that are often associated with the identity of us versus them. Um, and certain narratives over issues related to race, ethnicity, gender, and belonging more generally. Now, the values of interculturalism and diversity are today brought to the battleground, and the struggle is getting even more and more aggressive and violent. And here I'm not speaking about physical violence, but rather about emotional and cultural violence, symbolic violence that has made diversity efforts fragile and hence led to the what I call diversity fatigue. And the current debates about multiculturalism today, not only multiculturalism, but also migration policies and gender rights, exemplify this fatigue. So, a few days ago, I attended Milton Bennett's session on authoritarianism. So, he spoke about the rise of authoritarianism and group indoctrination. And something I believe is worth more discussion is the fact that authoritarian leaders today are elected by the people. They are chosen by the people. So, democratic elections today are leading to victories of strong and authoritarian leaders. Now, what might be the answer to that? So, the answer actually is not very complicated. It is simple. So, people who feel threatened want stricter rules. Now, this desire for security is not only cultural, it can also be economic, as research shows that economic challenges like inequality and stability or instability, also make people feel insecure, driving them to support strong leaders, even at the cost of democratic values. Now, as I said, this is a very basic and natural human defense mechanism. So when people feel threatened, whether this threat is real or imagined, so regardless of whether this threat is real or imagined, they tighten up. Physically, they prepare for self defense, whereas politically, they crave security, and authoritarian leaders often use that or take advantage of this need for order and stability, by promising very simple solutions and offering quick fixes. Now, if we have a look at the populist discourse today, we can notice that this psychology of threat exaggerations is a very well mastered technique. And this becomes or has become actually one of the major accelerators of divisive politics. Now, Trump did this very effectively during the 2016 electoral campaign. So he told Americans that the country was on the brink of collapse, pointing to Mexicans bringing violence, immigrants stealing jobs, and radical Muslims bombing and killing Americans. So his message was clear: I alone can fix it. And this unfortunately resonated with so many people. Now, again, it's always the magic word identity. And emotions here become even more and more dangerous when they become associated with identity or when they become themselves an identity construction mechanism. So, since anxiety building language and fear appeals can go as far as to redirect the public perception of the word around them. And it can go as far as to dominate and hegemonize minds and thus even shape decision making processes about security and cultural issues. Now, this strategy of creating a divide or a division between us versus them relies, let's say, on defining the national identity by contrasting it with a different other. Now, this idea of difference or antagonism is used to justify the need for security measures, of course. And the logic in divisive politics is very simple, is very basic. Now, for the self to survive, the other must be contained, eradicated, or kept out. Now, when issues are framed as existential threats to national security, it opens the door, let's say, to extreme and even violent policies. So, and even I would call it panic politics. So, this can influence, public attitudes and behavior, and most dangerously legitimize exceptional authority, including migration restrictions, entry bans, and mass deportations of refugees. Now, I'm not saying that this fear of the other is unprecedented. You know, it is not something new, but the fear of the other under populist leaders is different. It's no longer hidden or subtle, it's bold, explicit, and often exaggerated. So today we hear stronger calls to defend our people, our values, and our civilization. But this fear isn't always based on rational choices or historical necessity. Rather, it is becoming an identity construction mechanism. It is part of a deliberate strategy, a way to construct identity and push for security measures. Now, even more interestingly, I would say, the boundaries and borders that divisive politics establishes between the self and the other, and here we're speaking about the national self and the alien other, are not just physical or are not simply physical. They are also symbolic, and whether through physical or symbolic barriers, the goal is to secure the national community and reduce fear and anxiety. But of course, it's producing the counter effect. Now, under this logic, we are speaking about fear as the driving force behind public opinion, policy decisions, and actions. Now, we used actually to speak about the word anxiety in the field of intercultural communication, along with other concepts like ethnocentrism, prejudices, and stereotypes, since we do feel anxious or uncomfortable while communicating with individuals from other cultural contexts. And this anxiety is mainly derived from the fear of saying something wrong. Now, interestingly, today, we are no longer speaking about this individual anxiety, but rather about a whole intergroup anxiety. So, we are speaking about anxiety, uncertainty, and fear as a way of being um, that is increasingly shaping our perception of the people and the world around us. So, what we are witnessing today is a process of creating new sources of meaning that seeks to establish a network of similar people and new paths for the common vision of societies. Now, this vision, of course, includes only those seen as suiting the common good of the public, excluding everything and everyone who is different, uh, whether culturally, racially, ethnically, politically, religiously, or even sexually. Um, Now, before I continue with the discussion, I would like to ask you a question that I often ask myself. But I had more time actually to think about this question. Today you'll have only 10 minutes in the breakout rooms to reflect upon this question, which is mainly related to the culture of fear. Now, I will share the question in the chat, and it is mainly related to the role of interculturalists in advancing this culture of fear. So, my question is, can interculturalists today be unconsciously advancing this culture of fear? The answer may not be a simple yes or no, but I'll give you the time to think about it, and then we'll discuss it together.
Amna, can you please repeat the question just once, please?
Yeah, so the question is, can interculturalists today be unconsciously advancing this culture of fear? And here I'll be sharing it in the chat so that
Thank you very much, Amna.
Okay, so let's take some time to think about this question, and then we'll continue the discussion.
Okay, is about 7 minutes in the breakouts enough?
Yeah, from 8 to 10 minutes, would be fine as well.
Okay, so thank you. Yes. Okay. Okay.
I
Here we
think
go.
that the question wasn't shared.
Yes, I think some people are still here. And some people maybe were not clear as to what the question was. Yeah. Okay, I can't hear you, Lydia. I think your mic is closed. Sorry, just a minute. I'm going to stop the
Yes,
recording.
hello, Katie. Kate, the question was if the interculturalist nowadays make stronger even the fear of different or fear of others unconsciously, something like that. But I think that you put it in.
Anyway. And I think I can connect to a lot of the things that people have said. Actually, a lot of things have been said that I agree with and I think are relevant. I think what I will try to do is create a certain kind of context to this discussion, and then I'll give you my own viewpoint. But yeah, I think a lot of things have been said that are relevant. So I tried to come up with the title today as I was preparing for my little bit, and I've called it Resisting Power Inequality and Divisiveness in Intercultural Work. So, because that's basically what I'm going to talk about. How do we do that, right? And I'm an interculturalist, so the first thing I'm going to say, my answer is not the answer, but it's my answer so far, at least. Before we get started, I just really want to say, before I forget, an extended word of gratitude to all the participating SIETARs. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak on this, because I know it's not a uncontroversial topic, and it takes some courage to address this. So I really, really appreciate that. Before I forget, let me just say that. And before we get started, I just want to say a little bit something about the nature of my talk. So I think there's quite some people here that know me, some of you very well, some of you I've shared offices with even. And I think if you know me, I'm not a very confrontational person. I'm not a very, someone that seeks controversy generally. I'm a believer in dialogue and all these kind of things. Yet, I decided for today's talk to actually try to be a little bit more provocative and a bit more confrontational. And the reason for that, to be honest, is that I'm very concerned about these recent developments. And I think these developments haven't come falling from the sky. We've seen them coming for a long time. But I do think we're in a phase where it's getting even worse than it has been. And I'm honestly, that's my other side, and I'm going to be frank today, also concerned sometimes about interculturalism and the kind of answers that we have to these situations. And I feel, it's important to have a dialogue, but sometimes it's also important to have a bit of a critical debate and a critical reflection. And that's what I hope to give today. We're talking a lot about positionality nowadays, so I'll also share my own position in this. And I think it's interesting what's mentioned. Many people have moved to other countries. I eventually have as well. But my grounding in this field is my own background, in the sense that I grew up in a context where diversity, at least if we're talking about ethnicity or nationality or culture, was kind of commonplace. There's migration histories in my own family. Growing up, almost everyone I knew had that. And I had the experience that this was all of a sudden very, very publicly problematized and questioned. And the experience for me that has felt as if the way I grew up wasn't supposed to exist. And this was in a time when I was just graduating and figuring out what to do with my life. And I fell into this field, and 20 years later, I'm still here. But what I'm trying to say is that for me, even though my activities have branched out towards also all the other aspects of expatriation and international business, my benchmark is always, how do those models and concepts that we use, even for those other areas, how do they reflect back on this notion of kind of multicultural coexistence, at least within societies? We can also look at it globally, as you have before. But my benchmark is basically that. And I've been doing that for a very long time. In the last few years, my interest has really gone towards discussions of race and anti-racism, as many others have. And I now see it a little bit also as an endeavor to kind of connect ideas and theories of anti-racism and race with the field of interculturalism. And that's a little bit what I'm trying to talk about today. I know there's things in the chat. I can't read at the same time and open things, but if there's something urgent, then someone will stop me, I hope. If there's questions for clarification, then please speak. So I'm talking about resisting power inequalities. And I've been thinking a lot about that in the last couple of years, and I've been really inspired by the work of Francois Guadeloupe, who is a Dutch Antillean anthropologist. And he says it in much more elaborate terms, but I'm going to say it in my own words. And I will say, one way to look at this at least is through these two ways of resisting power inequalities, resisting injustice, resisting division. And one of them is the way of the fist, right? The fist pound in the air, standing for activism, which means that we confront these power inequalities head on, we call them out, we point our attention to it, we yell, we scream, we get angry. And this needs to happen, by all means. I'm not against it at all. In my private life, I'm somewhat of an activist sometimes as well, but in my professional life, I try to do something else, because I think the other way, again, leaning on Guadeloupe, and I'm struggling to find the right words and pictures, but I hope it comes across, is to try and change the script. So not by directly opposing these inequalities or injustices and calling them out and getting angry, but trying to come up with some other narrative, some other story, some other model for reality that that takes the power away from these inequalities, that stops at least playing into its hands. And I think the unique contribution potentially of this field is to do that, right? To create another picture, another model, another narrative about what this coexistence, let's call it multicultural coexistence, or conviviality, as sociologists call it, living together peacefully, how it could look like, and getting people on board with that. And I think that has been part of this field from the beginning. And I think, as George was just saying, I fully agree with that. I think we really need some updates, and I think we really need to look back and in order to look forward, right? And in order to do that, I think it's unavoidable to talk about the concept of culture. And I know that some of you are going, oh no, not the concept of culture again, right? Although some of you were alluding to it. But my answer is yes, the concept of culture, and for two reasons. And this is, again, the confrontational frankness speaking again. The first reason is I feel that not enough of us have taken those discussions to heart. I quite often hear and see things that make me concerned. I'll get back to examples later on, where I feel we really, really need to consider what we tell people and why. And the other part is that I think that there are some things that have been missing from that discussion that I want to fill in. And those are things that I didn't know about 5 years ago. So can't blame anyone. There's probably things I'll know in 5 years I don't know now either, but I think they're still important. And when I talk to my students about this, and I conceptualize this in the beginning, I always use this little way of doing that, because as we know, there's so many definitions of culture. I'm not even going to try at this point, but there's this very simple definition of culture, which is basically defining it by why it's not. And what culture is not, per definition, is, these definitions. Culture is everything that's not natural. Culture is everything that's not biological. So one thing you could actually say is culture is not race. And I'm going to explain to you why I'm saying that, right? So the first thing I'll say is, when I'm talking about race, I'm not talking about a biological reality, right? Because we know now, we have known for quite a while, there's no such things as different racial groups based on biology that you can categorize people into. That was a false idea. It was a pseudoscience that has caused some of the worst atrocities in human history, of course. And it's become increasingly evident to me over the years that race or culture was really intentionally meant to replace the notion of race. And I think that has a really couple of important implications, and I'll try to share them with you. So first of all, one thing that's a really important insight from race scholars like Barbara and Karen Fields is that race came as a consequence of inequality. So race was a legitimization of inequality and unequal treatment during colonialism, right? It was the way to justify oppression, colonization, exploitation, enslavement, and what kind of things, right? So it was the excuse that people used to justify those things, to say, well, you know, everyone's equal, everyone's the same, but these people are just a little less human than we are, so we get to do what we want. And another function that race has had, and this is, again, for me, been relatively new, but if you read the work, for example, of W.E. Du Bois, a very famous African-American sociologist, he writes about how race was also used as a way to break solidarity between so-called racial groups, right? By making sure that these people were kind of divided so that they couldn't pursue common goals, right? For example, if people were all poor and they were all disenfranchised, but they believed that these other people were inferior to them, at least they had that, right? That's what Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness, that white Americans at least could feel at least they were a little bit better than the black people that were equally poor or even poorer, so they, you know, wouldn't team up together to try to get a better life. And that will get relevant later on, I promise, because I think we're seeing this reappear in another way. And of course, you know, the concept of race has been heavily discredited after World War II, particularly after the Holocaust, to lesser extent, the crimes of colonialism that were very much connected to the Holocaust, but that's another story. And all of a sudden, right, race became delegitimized and no one was a racist anymore, right? So we'll see that even the far right, or the people that Amna were talking about, would deny under all circumstances, at least publicly, I think, to believe in racist ideas. And enter culture, right, after that delegitimization. And the way I'd like to look at that, or one way to look at culture, without even defining it, is see it as a revolutionary argument. And I mean revolutionary in two different ways, right? So the argument put forward by anthropologists, like the white gentleman in the middle, that's Bromislav Malinowski, doing research in Papua New Guinea. And what they put forward was a literally revolutionary idea, revolutionary in the sense that this was not how people thought at that point, and revolutionary because it was used for political aims. So they came forward and had done their field research and said, you know what, our conclusion is, first of all, the differences we see between groups of people, not caused by race, but they're caused by culture, you know, caused by people's long-standing histories, and that makes them different. And these cultures should be considered completely equal, right? They're not less civilized, they're just civilized in a different way. There's different cultures, right? The argument of cultural relativism. So I think we need to realize this argument was raised not in a political vacuum, right? But in a time when it was used to an extent to argue for more freedom and equality in the time of decolonization, right? Because the argument of anthropologists was also, if they have their own cultures, who are we to impose our ways, right? Now, I've heard what you said before, not saying that that influence has completely ended, but at least those direct colonial ties, right, were then broken. And what happened is that there was really a lobby almost from anthropologists to get those ideas on board on different levels. For example, on the UN and UNESCO, like current declarations on diversity and racism come directly from that time, right? They've hardly changed, where there's an argument made for we need to abandon race, we need to embrace culture, we need to respect and tolerate difference, we need to stop being ethnocentric, right? I always illustrate ethnocentrism this way, as a world map upside down, but from space there's obviously no gravity. So you literally have a subjective worldview. And I think this is also the notion of culture that was foundational to the field of intercultural communication. And again, I'm going to say my reading of this is that people as such were working, right, with good intentions, on good faith. And that argument in that time made a lot of sense. And I think if we look at the world we live in today, we really need to review if this is the route towards improvement. And I think that, again, we live in a very different world than we lived then in many ways. And we need to see if that argument still holds the same punch, so to speak. So some of it Amna has already addressed, right? So I think one thing we've seen in the last decades is that this idea of culture has been quite widely embraced, right? Many people now realize or see culture not only as architecture and art, but as pertaining to people's everyday lives, right? And it's become quite common to talk about my culture or your culture, or does this fit with your culture, or does this go against your culture, right? This has become a quite normal part of public discourse. And we've also seen that it's been widely embraced by the far right. So this was a bus stop in the Netherlands in a small town a couple of weeks ago, in a small town where they were about to open an asylum center. And this poster said, "Against cultures that are against ours," right? So it's almost acknowledging these different cultural differences, but at the same time, turning that discourse around and using it to create hostility, right? These same barriers, these same limits that can be used to ask for tolerance and ask for understanding and acceptance can then be used to turn that around and say, well, if you're saying everything is determined by culture, and we need to respect people because of their culture, if we have problems with them, whether real and imagined, we're going to say those are part of their cultures as well. And that's also part of the current discourse of ethno-nationalism that you might be familiar with, where you will find people on the far right literally saying that they think cultural differences are wonderful, and they happily experience cultural differences as long as it's as a tourist, traveling to other places, but they don't want to see it in their own countries, right? This was popularized into the mainstream. Amna was already talking about this, Samuel Huntington. I'm not going to reiterate that, but I would say, especially after 9/11, of course, this got a lot of traction, this idea of clashing civilizations. And I will say this, that I am concerned that, for example, the notion of cultural clashes, right, is something that's quite normalized in the intercultural field. I see it, for example, in Sweden, where it's a really, really normal part of the public discourse, even in intercultural discourse, that people are talking about how do we prevent cultural clashes. I've seen interculturalists legitimize this theory even by saying, oh, wow, yes, this shows the impact of deep cultural differences, right? That's interesting. And again, I don't think anyone is doing this with bad intentions, but I think we have to think of that proposition. If we're saying the world is something, you know, an archipelago of all these different cultural islands that almost unavoidably have to clash, or at least create misunderstanding or friction, but lo and behold, we have the solution. Here's our model to prevent or avoid it. I think that is a very dangerous proposition to throw into the world, right? Yet, to be honest, I see it very often. And what we're seeing now, this was what Amna was talking about, that fear of the cultural other, is nowadays also used to avoid solidarity and distract from social issues, as was done before with race, right? We've seen it in several countries in recent elections in the Netherlands, for example, where there's no increase in migration, there's no increase in asylum seekers, yet the whole election was made about asylum and refugees as the main social problems, where everyone agrees that there's huge social issues in the Netherlands around healthcare, around housing, around education. Yet the main problem, right, is pointed towards, the main issue is pointed towards immigration and the cultural other. So I think some people have made that analysis, and I think I agree. I'm allowed to say what I want today, so I'm taking the liberty to say, I agree that I think, right, this is consciously used as a strategy to distract people and to avoid that there's some kind of solidarity and to distract from other social issues by pointing to that fear of the other. And I think that we have to be extremely conscious and careful not to confirm that. And again, even if we do that with good intentions, if the proposition is, this is the problem, but we have a solution, right? How many people are going to buy that solution? Is that really what we want people to think? So the constant factor, as I see it, and I know many of you have heard of this term, but I'm going to at least try to take it one step further, is the notion of essentialism. So the notion of race was essentialist, and I think many renditions of culture that we've seen today are also essentialist. Now, what do I mean by that? For those not familiar with this term, essentialism, sorry, I'm one of these people with a very persistent cough, is the belief that social phenomena or social groups have some immutable, exclusive, or determining essence. Immutable meaning that it doesn't really change, right? That sure, a long term, maybe in a lifetime, several generations or whatever, but not at least for the time of our interaction or the time of our electoral period or whatever, right? They're mutually exclusive, so we assume that there is some hidden core that only belongs to this group. So we're thinking about Chinese culture, we're assuming it has some underlying core that somehow magically stops at the physical borders of that country. And it's seen as determining in the sense that it determines people's behavior to a very strong extent. And it allows the idea of exceptions, right? Even racial essentialism allowed the idea of exceptions. But those exceptions don't contradict the rule. It doesn't mean that we start to consider that maybe the whole idea of that core wasn't true. And it doesn't mean that people are actually literally advocating this, but that it's somehow apparent in the way that people are talking about this, right? And I tried to explain this to my students, and they were able to visualize it much better a couple of years ago, right? The culture and reality is this really, really messy affair, right? It's dynamic, it's paradoxical, it's contradictive sometimes, etc. And an essentialist view just points to the center to explain everything in this clean and neat way. And what we know, and of course that's the problem, because why is essentialism a problem? Well, because it leads to stereotyping and us versus them thinking, right? Gordon Allport, really famous social psychologist, wrote already in 1955, right, how essentialist beliefs lead to stereotyping and prejudice, and it leads to us versus them scenarios, and it leads to hostility and whatnot. Now here's what I think is important for us, is that I think discussion of essentialism, it started as a critique, right? It's very often phrased as a critique. To my knowledge, it started in feminism and then kind of went over to other social science disciplines, and has been aimed very often at the intercultural field, also now from within the intercultural field, but it's often a critique of a certain discourse. And I think that we need to not stop there, but I think that we need to see it as a tendency in and of its own right. And I've been thinking about that for a long time, and then lo and behold, I stumbled upon a niche field of social psychology that talks about psychological essentialism, right? And looks how people have tendencies to essentialize social phenomena in general and other people in particular. And if I think we see it as a tendency as such, right, it means that we need to pay particular attention to it and not only try to avoid being essentialist, but actively opposing essentialism in intercultural relations. So to paraphrase the African-American anti-racist Ibram Kendi, who once said we should stop trying to be non-racist, but we have to be actively anti-racist. Think of that what you will, but I think for us as educators, I'll paraphrase that by saying we need to be anti-essentialist, and non-essentialism is not good enough. We need to actively oppose the tendency that's of course being encouraged by the discourses that Amna was talking about. We need to actively oppose the tendency that people have to simplify, to categorize, to limit, to make these borders between groups, to assume that people are this one thing only, as Kirsten was saying, right? You're not this one thing, you're not belonging to only one group, belong to many groups. We need to actively do that. And not just as an afterthought. I think it needs to be on top of our mind as one of the main things we do. And how does that look like? Well, how I would see it is interculturalism then tries to aim for two main challenges in intercultural relations. The one is ethnocentrism. That still stands. And the other is essentialism. And if we look at ethnocentrism, I think the reasoning has been to say people are culturally different from one another. They can then be categorized into groups with different traits, right? This is all the theories that we know. And interaction, the challenge is to work out our differences. So I think no matter how much we talk about it, very, very often intercultural discourse always focus on differences. And now we've made those differences even more refined. We're talking about company culture, gender culture, whatnot. But I think we also really need to do something else and recognize that people categorize themselves and others into certain groups as well, right? People are thrown into groups without being asked, and then emphasize or even imagine that they are culturally different from one another. Where the challenge becomes, and somebody already mentioned this, I just want to reiterate that, the challenge is to sometimes find similarities and commonalities instead of just focusing on those differences. And if we see, again, that it's really a challenge, it makes sense that it doesn't always come natural to people, that we really need to take them by the hand and teach this, right? Because it sounds so obvious, oh, you just need to find similarities with people, end of story. But it's not that easy. It really requires an effort sometimes to recognize another person's humanity, to recognize that people are just as complex as you, and that maybe they weren't as different at all from you as you started to think, right? Amna and I have cooperated on this seminar, I think, quite successfully without assuming that we were essentially different from one another, right? What did we focus on? That we also had a lot in common in our views, in our histories, in our backgrounds. It's not to say that we need to deny that we can be different, but to that have as a starting point, right? The starting point is difference, that we need to accept difference or celebrate difference. I think sometimes we need to safely at least ignore difference for the time being. And that leaves me, I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to stop here because this is something I notice in my discussions with peers very often is misunderstood. I think perhaps most controversially, we also really need to acknowledge, right? If we de-essentialize, if we leave behind essentialist notions and are actively anti-essentialist, that not everything is culture, right? No matter how sophisticatedly we define it. I've been guilty of that myself, trying to make culture so sophisticated that everything became culture, but not everything is culture, right? It becomes the equivalent of holding a hammer and all you see is nails, right? That we as interculturalists only see culture in things, where there's other things at play, right? There's power, there's socioeconomic aspects, there's material aspects coming into situations. And I think that allows us also to engage with other fields, right? Like interethnic relations or sociology or social psychology, right? That we not only see culture in everything, and sometimes just acknowledge, no matter how we define it, we're better off not calling things cultural. All right, I hope that was provocative enough. I want to thank you for allowing me to speak. If you want to get in touch, feel free to do so. My website has just been re-updated, so you can actually find some things there. And yeah, just the book covers in case you're curious about the more solution-focused side of things. But I'll leave this for now here.